I would like to thank the National Museum of the Pacific War for inviting me to the symposium of commemorating 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. My talk will focus on Japan's decision to surrender, especially the role the Emperor Hirohito played in accepting the Potsdam Declaration and end the war. Before I discuss Emperor's role, I would like the audience to think about one polling question, which is one of the most controversial historical questions about August 1945. The question is, what caused Japan to surrender? So here is the polling question. Please go ahead and choose your answer from 1 to 3. Many historians continue to debate between the two factors in the polling question. Those are the atomic bomb and Soviet declaration of war. And these are the forces that ended World War II in the Pacific by forcing Japan's surrender. However, this approach presupposes that only the external military power forced the Japanese leadership to reach the decision to end the war. If Allied powers physically invaded the main island of Japan and destroyed and forced the military, then there would have been fewer controversies over the question of exactly what caused Japan to surrender. However, the fact remains that the Japanese authorities were the ones who reached the decision to accept unconditional surrender, and therefore it makes it challenging for historians to pinpoint exactly when, how, and why the Japanese leadership reached that difficult decision to surrender. In this presentation, I hope to shed some light on this debate over Japan's decision to surrender by looking at the third answer in the polling question, that is the internal forces that moved the Japanese leadership toward the surrender decision. Actually, this inquiry is nothing new to historians. Over 65 years ago, Professor Robert Buteau already offered foundational argument in his book, Japan's Decision to Surrender, on this point. He wrote, quote, "The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's declaration of war did not produce Japan's decision to surrender. For that decision in embryo had long been taking shape. When these events did do was to create that unusual atmosphere in which the theretofore static factor of the emperor could be made active in such an extraordinary way as to work what was virtually a political miracle." Unquote. So 65 years later now, with the newly available historical sources, Professor Buteau's brilliant argument or an observation about the political miracle of August 1945 still offers us a useful perspective, especially in the ongoing debate over the US decision to use the atomic bomb and the debate over the wisdom of unconditional surrender. Here, I would like to look at the role Emperor Hirohito played in the endgame of the war, because he's one of the most controversial figures in World War II. He was divine sovereign of the state and the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. But he escaped the war crimes trial under the US occupation after the war, and he continued to reign in Japan, in post-war Japan, as the symbol of the state and the unity of the people until his death in 1989. What the people remember the most about Emperor Hirohito's role in World War II is his sacred decision, so-called Seidan, to accept the Potsdam Declaration and end the war. To this day, the role of the emperor in the decision-making process in Japan during World War II remains a controversial subject. Let me briefly explain the power structure in pre-war and wartime Japan, what power he really had or did not have. Was he a robot, just following the orders of the military and the government? Or was he a divine, absolute monarch who could make decisions regarding Japan's national policy? I see the power structure in pre-war and wartime Japan basically as the three-way sort of triangular power struggle among the imperial court, the government, and the military. Originally, if you look at the Meiji Constitution, the authors who wrote this constitution created a power center to themselves without writing themselves into the constitution. They were known as genro. They basically placed the emperor as the nominal head of the state, and they guided the emperor, who didn't really have the power to make decisions. Under the emperor, there was the government, the cabinet, and separately there was the military, the supreme command, and separate army and the navy under the supreme command. The problem of this constitutional structure was that basically the government and the military were totally separate, and then there was nobody to coordinate the two power centers except the nominal emperor, who was guided by the genros. Now that worked well until early 20th century, but the genros did not live forever. They died, all of them died by the early 1920s. Then the question was, who was going to really make the final decision? The emperor, who was treated as almost nominal figure, or the government, or the military. And there was this power struggle, three-way power struggle. And that's where the Emperor Hirohito stepped in as a young emperor. In order to understand the thoughts and actions of Emperor Hirohito in the final months of World War II, it is important to understand what he went through before and during the the so-called 15 Years' War, which started with the Japanese Guangdong Army's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. As I demonstrated in my book, Emperor Hirohito and the Pacific War, Emperor did not support the army's aggressive military expansion in Manchuria or in China. But the military basically ignored his personal opinions because they thought that he didn't know really what's going on in the continent. Emperor himself became increasingly distrustful of the army's propensity to use armed forces to settle disagreements with China, which eventually led to the US-Japanese disputes over China. In 1941, the emperor was again personally against going to war with the United States and the British Empire, because nobody could assure that Japan could win in the war. Also, nobody told him how Japan was going to end the war. There was no clear exit strategy. However, once the hostilities commenced, the emperor's task as Daigenshi, commander-in-chief, was to support his country's war efforts to a successful conclusion. So he played a sort of like a cheerleader role. However, the emperor's hope for Japan's victory rapidly disappeared from the summer of 1942 on, the Battle of Midway. While he had to endorse the military's plans for decisive battles, his doubts about Japan's ability to win the war continued to increase throughout 1943. I may be risking oversimplification of facts here, but let me highlight some of the important turning points in Emperor Hirohito's thoughts and actions that would explain his position, what his position was by the summer of 1945. September of 1943 was the first important turning point in Hirohito's thinking. He began to lose hope for Japan's victory in the war when Japanese forces were defeated in the Owen Stanley mountain range in eastern New Guinea. In the same September 1943, the Japanese military changed its strategy from one of offensive to defensive. In order to stop the enemy's advance, the Supreme Command adopted the so-called absolute defense perimeter strategy to win a decisive battle before negotiating any peace. Around this time, Emperor Hirohito initiated a frank exchange of opinions with the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Kido Koichi. They started to talk about the need to end the war, which was still a taboo in Japanese society at that time. Nobody was publicly talking about ending of the war. However, Kido and Hirohito at this point were still thinking about a victory in a decisive battle that would allow Japan to seek peace negotiations with the United States, who did not really want to negotiate peace. They wanted unconditional surrender. The problem with the idea of decisive battle was basically that, as many people pointed out, Japan could not win in any decisive battle. The resignation of Prime Minister and General Tojo Hideki in the wake of Japan's defeat in Saipan in July of 1944 was another important turning point, because Tojo's resignation allowed the balance of power among the three power centers that I mentioned earlier in Japan to shift in favor of the end the war factions and well, you can call it peace factions. Strategically speaking, Japan's defeat in Saipan also meant that Japan lost the command of air in the Asia Pacific. So Japan continued to lose in the Philippines and eventually Iwo Jima and then to Okinawa. The trajectory of Hirohito's thoughts and actions indicate that, here is my kind of bold argument, if the emperor had possessed real power over his own army, and if he had an opportunity and will to intervene, he might have been able to make a move to seek a negotiated peace with the United States sometime in May or in June of 1945, as Japan continued to lose in the Battle of Okinawa. However, in reality, the emperor at that time did not have means or courage to prevail over the army to negotiate peace terms with the United States, who was demanding unconditional surrender. In retrospect, from the perspective of Japan's internal power dynamics, by the time Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro formed his cabinet on April 7th, 1945, we see finally the beginning of the efforts to pave the way to end the war. By then, the end the war factions and peace factions seized the leadership positions in the imperial court and the foreign ministry in particular, as well as the navy ministry. And they were quietly searching for possible peace terms that might be acceptable to the diehards of the army, particularly the war ministry and army general staff, but also diehards in naval general staff. The strategy of decisive battle, which was utterly failing, needs to be understood against the backdrop of this shift in the three-way tug of war among the imperial court, the government, and the military. Critics of Emperor Hirohito, such as Professor Herbert Bix, argue that the emperor accepted the Potsdam Declaration only after 2 atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war, and only after negotiating with the United States to save himself and the imperial house during the last few days before Japan's surrender on August 15th. But this interpretation ignores what was happening at the imperial court from May through July of 1945. Although nobody publicly discussed the termination of war because it was a taboo in Japanese society, the court advisors such as Lord Privy Seal Kido and Prince Konoe, and the peace factions in the government and even in the Navy, and even the distinguished Imperial University professors, they were all secretly communicating and exchanging ideas about the so-called Seidan scenario. Around the time of Japan's defeat in Iwo Jima, that was February of 1945. The Seidan scenario suggested that the peace factions in government and the military would somehow work out peace terms with the enemy and set a stage for the emperor to issue his sacred decision, Seidan, to ask the military to put down arms and surrender. As early as March 9th, Kido told Hirohito about this idea. So Hirohito was aware of this Seidan scenario from March 1945. The biggest question was how to negotiate and agree on peace terms or surrender terms with the United States, who wanted unconditional surrender of Japan. From May to June of 1945, we see the emperor's position changed significantly on the question of peace terms in particular. The emperor, before the American invasion of Okinawa began in April, he refused to concede the two peace terms. One is the complete disarmament of Japanese forces. The other, the punishment of the leaders responsible for war. He could not accept those peace terms until early April. However, by early May, the emperor felt that Japan's acceptance of these two terms were unavoidable. That means by May 1945, Hirohito realized that the only peace term he must protect at all cost was the imperial house and the preservation of imperial institution, vaguely known as kokutai, meaning national polity. In May and June, the emperor received terrible news, one after another. The news of German surrender on May 7th. Then the army chief, General Umezi, came back from China to report that Japan's defense was failing in China. There wouldn't be a way to defend China if the Americans invaded China. That shook the army generals down. And then came the report from the Navy Admiral Hasegawa, who was sent to investigate Japan's homeland defense planning. And the report again shook the emperor. Admiral Hasegawa said that Japan was totally lacking preparedness to defend home island. So the emperor took some unusual steps in June. He relied on Lord Privy Seal Kido as his informal agent to lay groundwork for peace negotiations. Kido built consensus on early termination of the war among Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Yonai. And then he even contacted Daihat's leader, War Minister Anami. On June 22nd, the emperor took an unusual step of convening an Imperial Conference of Big Six. At this conference, he personally opened the discussion, which was another unusual step, and asked the participants to search for ways to terminate the war. However, in retrospect, we can say that both the emperor and the Japanese government chose a wrong channel to negotiate peace terms with the United States. They didn't go directly to the United States. They chose to ask the Soviet Union to serve as mediator. Stalin told Japan to wait for his response until he returned from the Potsdam Conference. Of course, he had no intention of serving as a mediator, but he didn't tell that to the Japanese. He already promised to enter war against Japan as early as January 1945 at the Yalta. When the Japanese government received the Potsdam Declaration asking for Japan's military's unconditional surrender, the Suzuki cabinet chose to sit on the ultimatum until Stalin would respond to their request for mediation. However, Prime Minister Suzuki's comment to the press referring to mokusatsu, which meant kill it with silence, was interpreted as Japan's rejection of the Potsdam Declaration by the Truman administration, and hence the atomic bombs. Stalin at this juncture declared war on Japan instead of responding to Japan's request for mediation. As events were happening so quickly between August 6th and when the first atomic bomb fell, and August 14th, when Japan finally decided to end the war by accepting the Potsdam Declaration. The Seidan scenario was eventually activated through the concerted efforts by the Imperial Court, the Suzuki cabinet, and the Navy. When the Big Six in the Supreme War Council was divided over one condition or four conditions for the acceptance of Potsdam Declaration, the emperor was asked by the Prime Minister Suzuki to take his side and express his opinion. So the emperor did. He spoke in favor of one condition: to accept the Potsdam Declaration and end the war. The only condition that Emperor Hirohito truly wanted was the preservation of the imperial house. To him, the imperial house and the sovereignty of Japan was one and the same. Therefore, what the Suzuki cabinet had to do after the double shock of atomic bomb and Soviet declaration of war was to transform Emperor Hirohito's personal opinion to end the war by accepting Potsdam Declaration with one condition into a state decision through the process of Seidan. Hirohito's personal opinion might not have carried a lot of weight, but when the government went through the formal process of Imperial Conference deliberation, the prestige of the throne made a difference. And that was what we consider as a political miracle. This is the end of my talk. And before I finish this, I would like the audience to think about